Hey, landlords, and welcome to episode 156, Security Deposit Funds. In today's episode, we're going to discuss how $38 held up a major real estate transaction for one of our clients.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Yeah, as Steve was talking about, we did have a client that we were talking to on the phone, and $38, that's all it took to hold up a multi-unit, right? Many units inside of this one building. And the reason that it came down to was actually security deposits, and more specifically, where the funds were being held. So this kind of, once we had this conversation with this landlord, we're thinking about it, we're like, wow, this is a pretty serious problem. And we started doing some more digging, and actually I recently wrote a blog post with a video in there. After doing some research, I realized that pretty much like half the states in the United States have specifications of what you can do with the security deposit funds. So a good example is a place like Kentucky. So when it comes to the state of Kentucky, landlords must disclose where the security deposit is being held, along with the bank account number, and no landlord shall be entitled to retain any portion of a security deposit if deposited into a separate account, or if not deposited into a separate account, excuse me. So I read that and I was like, wow, like I know that we talked about this actually on a previous episode, how security deposits are the number one thing that is brought to tenant-landlord court, and that's the thing that everybody fights over. And in this particular case, it's pretty much saying if you're a landlord in Kentucky and you go to that court and it's found out that you didn't have that security deposit in a separate account by itself, that tenant's probably going to win. And I just thought that was pretty crazy when I read that.
Yeah, I've heard some of the craziest stuff I've heard actually revolves around security deposits. And one really quick example I can give you is a landlord in Pennsylvania that ended up having to pay a security deposit back twice because he refunded the money in cash and never wrote a receipt. And the tenant took them to court and said, I never got my security deposit back. And then the landlord was found legally responsible to pay that security deposit back. So that landlord was obviously, and rightfully so, all kinds of fired up that he had to pay 2 security deposits back. So there's a lot of little things that you can get caught up on. And there are plenty of people out there that are looking to take advantage of any misstep. And they know there are tenants that know the laws better than landlords, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that will nail you to the wall the first chance they get. And this landlord was an unfortunate victim of that. I'm sure the tenant was very excited when he got that money in cash and didn't get a receipt and said, oh, perfect.
Oh, that's terrible.
It really is. But
I think one of the things too that we stress too is if you're on one side of the fence or the other, you tend to commiserate with the people that you are. So like for us, like it's landlords, right? And you're like, tenants are the worst. And yeah, sometimes there are bad tenants, but there's also bad landlords. So it's knowing what these laws are and making sure you're doing the right thing regardless of what side of the fence you're on. And another state that had a specific law, and this is going to tie back into what you were talking about, that $38, is New York, because we're located here and that's where that client was. And basically in the New York law, what it says is if you own a multi-unit of 6 units or more, that you must put the security deposits into separate accounts that are interest-bearing accounts and then pay out on that interest. So that's where we kind of saw this when we started talking to this landlord. And Steve, you can take over, but tell him what he told us.
Yeah, he basically had said the interest added up to $38. That was, the interest that all these tenants had rights to. And the attorney on the buyer's side was basically saying this transaction cannot go through until we know exactly. And by the letter of the law, I get it, right? I get why the attorney would say that and why the attorney wanted to make sure that this was in order. From the landlord's perspective who's selling the property, and $38 becomes a sticking point, like he had mentioned to us. What did he say? I think he said it took over 8 hours to finally resolve this, and him sitting down and figuring out and doing all the math and working it out. And in the end, it was $38. And like he said, that was the worst money management he's ever seen, time management, where he worked for 8 hours to come up with a $38 check that ended up getting written and added to the transaction to make it go through.
I can see why the attorney for the buyers might have done that, because they know that legally they had to figure that stuff out. And they're like, we don't care about the $38. We care about the fact that we're going to have to figure out if we get taken to court, what we owe that person in interest off of, like, even if we owe them $1.50 off of their security deposit money. So it's just a really interesting case that shows that, why do you want to follow these laws? Well, I did a video on this actually, but it's the idea that it's like car insurance when it comes to security deposits. You don't have a problem if you don't get in any trouble. Like if you don't have car insurance and you never get pulled over and you never get in an accident, you're not going to get any trouble. But the moment that you get in that accident or you get pulled over, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So with security deposits, maybe you haven't been doing it the right way all along and you're like, well, who cares? But then the moment that you actually have that interaction with a tenant who's going to, call you out on it, you're going to be like, wow, I wish that I was doing this right all along.
Yeah. And that landlord that we were, that the seller made a good point. From that point on, that day on, the first thing that he did was he went to it turned out to be a local bank. So we can't even give that bank a shout out because they're only in our local area. He went to a local bank who understood the local laws and had a special account that
I think it was actually a commercial type account that they could, that
allows you to basically manage multiple sub accounts under that one single account, and then that way put all of each unit's security deposits into each of those sub accounts that are treated as their own accounts, but he can still manage them from one single place. So it makes it easier on the landlord to have all these additional sub accounts. And if you're in a state like Kentucky, you don't want to be giving your tenants your actual bank account number. Give them the sub account number that only applies to that specific rental unit. You know what I mean? That's a no-brainer for me right there. But in this case, he had, he built it. Now he has established this relationship. Everything that he does goes through this bank to set up these sub accounts, and everything is done properly. And of course, that makes the accounting much easier too. Much easier to figure out. You're looking at a single account's bank statements to determine what the interest is and how much is in there, and you can clear it out when it's time to give them back their deposit.
Yeah, and it's really important to figure out what your state says because they really vary widely. I mean, this wasn't the most exciting topic that I got to really dive into, but I was looking state to state and seeing what they said. And I got some other notes here where in Massachusetts, it says the landlord must pay tenants 5% interest on the security deposit annually, or the interest paid by the financial institution, which must be located in Massachusetts. That interest can be paid yearly and within 30 days of the termination date. So it's like, they spell it out pretty clearly for you, and the institution has to be in Massachusetts, but then you go somewhere else, and Maryland says that landlords must pay interest on security deposit of $50 or more. I don't know how many landlords are taking $48 security deposits, so I don't know how that got established.
Right.
But yeah, it's just interesting when you go state to state how much it can change. And the last one I'll read to you here is in Maine, upon request, a Maine landlord must disclose orally or in writing the account number and the institution where the deposit is being held.
Let me just make a suggestion. I know that the law may say orally or in writing, but everything that we've learned, do it in writing. Do it in writing, because if it happened orally, it's too easy to say it never happened. So get that acknowledgement and documentation, do it in writing. Just do yourself that favor ahead of time.
So if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, all right, like I want to check this out. I want to see, if my state, if there's something that applies to me and I need to change the way that I'm doing this. In the show notes for this particular episode, I will have links to all of that information that you can find specific to your state. And you can always go on our website under landlord resources. You can do the drop down and you'll find these state specific laws. And the last thing I want to mention here is kind of a shorter podcast, but after doing a little bit of research, I did get a mailer from Capital One, and I tend to get these a lot from them, and I just throw them out because I've had a credit card with them for, probably 15 years now. And this particular one kind of caught my attention because I happened to be researching this topic. And, this is why they always send out those stupid mailers, right? Because they know eventually some nerd's going to be researching landlord security deposit laws, and we're going to get them with this. But what it said on there is you can do a Capital One 360 savings account, and it allows up to 25 sub accounts on the same account. And I saw that and I was like, wow, that sounds pretty good. So I called Capital One. I talked to a customer service rep because I wanted to get a little more detail on it. There's no fees, no hidden fees, nothing like that. And the nice thing too is that it's interest-bearing account. I believe it's a 0.75% annual yield. And I set up an account and I already had a Capital One credit card. So if you happen to use one, and by the way, we're not sponsored by Capital One, but if they want to give us, a couple $100,000, we'll take it. But you can log in with that same login, and when you go in, it's pretty simple. You just click on the 360 savings, and probably within a couple minutes, I set up a couple different accounts and started depositing security deposits in there. And it's just a really good practice to have set up. And it's one of those things that just kind of floats around your head. You're like, now that you know it, and you might know that you're in the wrong the way you're doing it, you'll think about it, but you won't do anything about it. With Capital One 360, I found that, you're looking at 5-10 minutes of work.
Yeah. And let me just say, if I would have had this conversation a year ago, I'm definitely the type of person that would have been fearful of having multiple accounts. It just seemed like it was too much and unnecessary, and why would I do that? Today, I only know this because I went to the bank yesterday and had to resolve an issue. I've got 11 accounts, which seems crazy.
Baller.
No, which seems, but what I did was I started figuring out, okay, my bank lets me open up interest-bearing checking accounts, much like Capital One, and I started opening up these savings accounts for different budget items. So my son's school, vacation fund, everything that you would typically budget or save for, I've set up an account so that I can seamlessly transfer money from my checking into those individual savings accounts. And it's like the old school envelope system that our parents taught us when we were kids. You take your paycheck and then you split up, well, this money goes to your car payment and then this money goes to your insurance, and you're taking that money out and removing it from the larger sum and putting it into their own respective places. And for me, it was a sort of a paradigm shift, right? A mentality that I needed to adopt to be okay with having all these accounts and looking at it that way and managing that way. But once you do it, it is so easy. And I looked at it like, man, if I would have done this 10 years ago, the amount of money I would have saved, because I have a better routine in place to be able to track it and save it. Same thing goes for landlords. You have those accounts, put the security deposit in there, and then leave it.
Yeah, forget about it.
Forget about it. Yeah, you don't have to think about it. And in the case where that landlord had $38 held up on a real estate transaction, had he set it up in those separate accounts, easy. All you're doing is pulling bank statements to show what the interest is. Case closed. End of conversation. So definitely worth the little bit of setup ahead of time to make sure that things are running nice and smooth from that point forward.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and the last thing I should mention too with the Capital One account that I had set up, they let you put a nickname to every account too. So it's pretty nice. Like I can log into my account, I see my credit card, but I also see a money market savings, and then I see these sub accounts where it's just like levering up or levering lower, and it's got those security deposits tucked away, and it's just one more thing I don't have to think about. And in some cases too, maybe if you're a landlord on a shoestring budget kind of thing, it's just a good practice, like Steve was saying, where it keeps that money in a separate account and you're not going to touch it. Because technically speaking, you shouldn't be spending that money. So it can kind of help prevent that too. So it's just a great practice to have.
Definitely. Again, the biggest takeaway here is learn your local laws. Know what they are. If you're in Massachusetts, especially, those laws are constantly changing. Everything there is constantly changing.
What was the one that we just found out about where it had just updated? Was it application fees or something?
Yeah, application fees. And it sort of seemed to encompass security deposits as well, saying that you couldn't, it capped on what you could charge for a security deposit. But then it also mentioned that you couldn't charge any upfront fees, which fall into the category certainly of an application fee. And some landlords were structuring the security deposit in a way that the upfront fee fed into the security deposit as like kind of if you get the apartment, we'll apply it to your security deposit. So they were taking a chunk of it and using it as an application fee. Massachusetts found that to be unlawful. So you cannot do that. Massachusetts in particular, I'll tell you right now, if you're a listener and you're a landlord in Massachusetts, take the time to read through what your rules are, because they're different from any other state in the country, and it's very tenant friendly, put it that way. No doubt about it. So watch yourself in Massachusetts as a landlord.
Yeah. And last note, guys, if you are looking for information on this, just go to RentPrep. You can even just do a search bar in the top. If you put in 156, that'll get you to this episode easy enough. And we'll have all the show notes where you can check out resources and figure out what your state specific laws are.